Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Aiza Ashraf. I'm a visiting fellow at National Dialogue Forum and a graduate of University of Massachusetts. So the most fascinating part of my public policy research was to look at how gender mediates and regulates the processes of policy making in Pakistan. As we all know that Pakistan is ranked lowest in terms of gender equality. And being a young woman, this is a matter of huge concern for me, considering that the lives of millions of young girls are negatively affected by gender discrimination. But at the same time, we also know that gender discrimination is a global phenomenon, and it's not just limited to the case of Pakistan. So we would like to know what are the key terms or the key factors that the drivers of gender discrimination, both at the global level and in terms of Pakistan. And so to discuss this and many other relevant issues, I have a very special guest with us today, Mr. Jamshed Kazi, who is the country representative of UN Women in Pakistan with extensive global experience. Prior to this, Mr. Kazi has served in Norway as a director of UNDP, and he has also served in Ethiopia and Laos, and he is a graduate of Kennedy School of Business at Harvard University. So welcome, Mr. Kazi, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can you please tell us about the major issues in terms of gender discrimination in Pakistan?
As you rightly said, gender discrimination is not a challenge for Pakistan alone. So I think we have to recognize that there is no single country in the world out of all the rankings that has a perfect gender score. Right. This includes countries such as Norway, Iceland, Sweden, who rightfully pride themselves in having one of the most gender equal societies. But even there, and as I've served in Norway, I know from speaking to many of my colleagues there that it wasn't a long time, only maybe 30 years ago in Norway, they were still struggling to have women get to work and get out of the homes. So it isn't really that far back when we look at it. But I mean, gender discrimination, I think if we look at life cycle approach, it starts even before you're born. So, and you know, I will use anecdotes, less data, because I know some of you like data. I'm more of a story type of person, so I like to tell stories. And it, I think, illustrates the issue more powerfully. You know, in a city like Lahore, for instance, I have, you know, someone that I knew, and I was asking her, she has one boy and one girl. So when she delivered her, the baby boy in the hospital in Lahore, there was rejoicing. The nurses, the attendants actually came around, and in fact they expected a bakshish or a tip because the boy was born. Now 2-3 years later, she went to the same hospital and she gave birth to this girl. Quiet. None of the you know, the hospital, the same people were there, but nobody asked for a tip. So in fact she gave a tip to say, I have a baby girl, and they thought that was a very odd thing. Nobody tips them when a daughter is born. So I think just to illustrate that discrimination, that thinking, that mindset that, you know, we are already judging the worth of a boy versus a girl at birth. And then that, of course, over the years you look at nutrition. Sometimes, especially in the rural areas, if the boy is fed first, the girl is fed last, or the girl is helping with the you know, with the mother in the kitchen, and therefore eats only later. That has obviously the level of nutrition, level of focus. Same thing happens in education. So the discrimination from birth to health to education to determining, of course, who she should marry or not marry, whether she gets to go to work, and even at work, sometimes there are situations when women are not paid as much as men for doing the same amount of work. So, and going beyond that, it's about, you know, you come to a point where if you're going to be inheriting any land or property from your parents, even there is a discrimination that persists. And even if you are able to inherit land, there is an expectation sometimes by the brothers that, oh, you can't handle this, give it to us, we'll take care of it for you. So throughout the life cycle till the very end, I think that discrimination continues, and it's and this is in spite of the fact that, you know, if you look at the Constitution of Pakistan, Article 25A, very clearly it says there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex. So documents, you look at the laws, you look at the documents, you look at the Constitution, nowhere does it suggest that this discrimination is there, but it is very much embedded.
Yeah.
So I think I'm telling you something that is not new. All of you sitting here, many of you know this, you're nodding with me. So I don't think I'm saying anything new. So that's the sort of, it's quite pervasive. And it's and part of the work we do and many others is how do we try and address some of these things across the full spectrum in Pakistan. That's the big challenge.
So taking further your point on education, so we have seen that the female enrollment rates in recent years have increased, but at the same time the female labor force participation has not. So how do you see this trend? Like, where is the gap and why is the gap?
I came to Pakistan as in this position about 4 years ago, over 4 years ago. One of the first places, I get invited to all these places and there is receptions and you meet people all the time. So I was at this event and I met this middle-aged woman. She came up to me. She was curious to say, hey, there's a man as the head of UN Women I must meet. So I said, hi, I'm Jamshed. I'm here with UN Women. And she said, oh, why don't you meet my daughter? She's a young graduate, an MBBS doctor. I said, wow. I said, where did you graduate from? We started talking and then I asked her, so where do you practice? Silence. I asked again, where do you practice? And the mother was felt a little, I don't know, embarrassed or awkward. She pulled me aside, said, "Nahi, beta, she's not practicing. You see, she's getting married." And I said, "Well, that's very good, but she should continue her medicine after." She says, "No, that's not going to happen." And then I knew enough what was going on, but I was pretending to be naive and I was being obnoxious, and I said to her, then I said, well, and then she said, no, but you don't understand. You might be new, but here, she's gone through medical school because that's where all the rishtas are.
Right.
It was very clear that she invested years and years and years and years of education in her daughter so she could be ideal marriage material. And I again, jokingly, I said to her, I said, "Madam, if you don't mind me saying, if I had a daughter and my plan was to get her married to another doctor, I would simply say, beta, why don't you go and hang out at the canteen every week and you'll find the boys. Why go through all that studying if that's all you wanted to do?" So, I think I didn't meet her again. She was not very happy with that. But my point here is that there is a greater level of enrollment in medical school, in dentistry, in engineering. In some faculties, you see 60-70% of women in the secondary, the tertiary education. But when you go to the labor force, it's around 25% of the labor force participation. So something is wrong. Oftentimes the policy prescription is that we need to have more girls in education. And education is going to solve our problems. Fine, we are seeing many more women in faculties across the country. I see many more women enrolled. Then I go to the private sector and they tell me, we can't find these women. Where are these women that you claim are educated? Where are they? I go to public sector, they say there aren't any women. We're trying to hire them, they're not coming. So I'm often baffled because I see all these, fantastic, phenomenally talented, educated women, and then I go to companies and I go to private sector and I say to them, I've just met, and they say, yeah, but they're not applying, or something is wrong. So there's something happening that we have to fully understand between graduation and entering into the job market. And that's where I think the focus ought to be. Not that we by simply sending more girls to school and university isn't going to solve that problem. So we have to look at issues such as transportation. Are they able to get safely and affordably from home to office? There are issues around, obviously, social, cultural, parental pressure to get married, don't leave the house, okay. The negotiation that they have to go through to beg and plead, please let me do my undergraduate. Please, please, please. And then marry me. Get me married. Or they will say, can I please finish my master's? Then get me married. And that sort of negotiation continues. And then, of course, the common thing is, well, yeah, you can do all those things once you get married. And once you get married, then that negotiation starts again. So those cultural barriers, transportation, issues around, I think, even harassment at the workplace, that's something that has come up. Something as simple as, I'll give you another very quick example. In many places I've gone to in government offices, including in, including KP and in Balochistan, but not only, you see so few women, and then you ask them, well, why are they so few women? And then, somebody told me, well, this whole floor, this whole building has no female washrooms. It's a government office.
That's the case, yeah.
Could be justice. Usually it tends, sometimes justice, sometimes police. They say there's not a single washroom. And it just, for me, it's something that, for most men, this is something that just, you can't get your head around. Why is that, because we don't think about these things. If we have to go somewhere, we go. They don't need a washroom for that. Men will go anywhere where they can. But without the washroom, I know one gentleman told me, oh, Jamshed, that's not a big deal. There's no ladies' washroom, but she can come and use mine anytime she wants. It's it's open, and she's more than welcome to use it. And I said, with all due respect, sir, why would a woman in your office feel comfortable enough to come to you and say, sir, can I use your washroom? That's not going to happen. And he really looked at me and he didn't understand. And then I had to explain, well, apart from that, if a woman is coming in and out of your office during the day, there are all sorts of theories and things people will concoct in their minds. So I think there's some simple things like that also that are impediments. So I'm just saying that there are multiple things that add up to why women are not coming out. But I think there's many more, and there are many women here maybe who can also speak to that issue, because that's something that really it really frustrates me a lot, because when I visit companies and I visit public sector, and they keep telling me, you tell us there's no shortage of women in this country, you tell us there's no shortage of talent, but we experience something different. So I have to then try and figure out how to convince them that they need to keep trying harder and make it a more enabling environment. Parental leave, maternity leave policies is another one, where women, when they do go to work and they have to go back for raising kids, coming back to work is another real challenge, because the years have passed and they often come back and their peers have gone ahead, the men, and they start back at a lower level sometimes. So I think those are some of the big challenges. I will say one good example that I came across when I was visiting Iceland for a conference, and we were called into a company which was headed by a woman. She was running a seafood company, so she exported salmon and all sorts of processed fish, which is most of the people you see there were men in boots, because fish smell, and it's like you would think that that's not something women want to be working in, but her top level senior managers were all women. And so we asked her, what is the secret of having all your top leadership women? And she said, simple. I just went out and looked for the best, and this is who I got.
The best, yeah.
And we said, okay, no, but still, how is it that this happened? She says, well, I'll tell you a secret. Equally discriminate against the men. And I said, what is that? What do you mean equally discriminate against the men? She says, well, in my company we have a policy that any man or woman, if there is a man working in my company and his wife is pregnant, he is forced to take the same amount of paternity leave as a woman who is taking maternity leave. So we thought about it a little bit, and she says, listen, subconsciously we have eliminated the barrier and the discrimination in the hiring manager's head, because, for instance, when you're hiring somebody and you're interviewing them and you see this woman that you're interviewing is visibly pregnant, of course it'll be stupid to ask, are you pregnant? Because that's discrimination. But there is something going on in your mind saying, if I hire this woman she's going to look like she's leaving on maternity leave and she'll be gone for 6 months. So all that money and investment is going down the drain. So let me just hire this other guy who will not that will not happen to him. So in this particular company, it doesn't matter. So if the man is hired, his wife gets pregnant, he has to go for 6 months the same way. So she said, when I did that, I reduced and eliminated subconscious bias, and that's who I have. So I thought that was fascinating. Of course, we may not be able to replicate that here yet, but it just goes to show that when you're actually reducing the barriers and reducing the biases, then you basically are able to really come out with merit and talent on an equal footing.
Great, yeah, that's very insightful. Thank you. Talking about that women don't go into the labor force, and we all know that they disproportionately perform the household work, and there is no monetary value of that work in government's GDP. So while countries like New Zealand, they have recently starting to count unpaid work in their GDP. So do you think that we should replicate the same model in Pakistan as well, that count unpaid work in government's GDP as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that if you look at Europe and you look at Pakistan and other countries in this neighborhood, there is in every case we are seeing women in greater numbers get to the workforce, even though in Pakistan it's very slow. But over the past 30-40 years, more and more women have entered the workforce. But there is one thing that hasn't changed in all these years across continents, or have changed very little, is the amount of work that men do in the domestic sphere. So if you count the number of hours men spend in the kitchen in 1950 versus 2000, hasn't changed marginally. So what does that mean? It actually means that when women are going to work, they still have to do all that other work. So their work burden is doubling, if not tripling. So it's understandable that some women, when I speak to them, they say, you know what? I am choosing not to work, even though I'm very educated. Why? Because it's just too much work. And that's my choice. And then one has to respect, okay, if that is your choice, that's fine. But then usually it's a combination of things. But coming to we did a study, UN Women globally. So on average, for every hour a man spends in the household doing whatever, a woman spends 4 hours. In Pakistan, the ratio is 1:11. So if a man is spending 1 hour, if you're lucky, if the man is spending 1 hour in the kitchen or doing laundry or doing something with household, a woman is spending 11 hours on average. So the gap in Pakistan is colossal, which means, to me, frankly, it's, yes, we can count the number of hours women spend, and we can monetize it, and that'll be a huge amount financially, to demonstrate, look, this is how much work women do, because that work isn't counted. Because it's not counted, it's seen as not valuable, and therefore doesn't enter the GDP figures. But where we need to work more is to the only way men will begin to realize that this is work is if they're made to do it. So as more and more men are told, pick up your socks, go chop a few onions, go look after the little one, change the bottle, those sorts of things, which, by the way, in Pakistan I have seen a handful of men start to do, but not nearly enough. Then they begin to realize, wow, this is a hell of a lot of work. Over the years I've realized, because luckily for me, or unluckily for me, my wife is one of those individuals who say, well, before you begin to, you're UN woman in the office, but you're also UN woman when you come home.
Right.
So your work doesn't stop. So hence I have to be fully in character the whole time. But anyway, jokes aside, I think that needs to change. And if you look at Nepal, for instance, you talked about New Zealand.
Yeah.
But in Nepal, the way they calculate this is, even if a woman in a rural area is collecting firewood or collecting water, they officially in their data, they count that as work.
Right.
Because collecting water and collecting firewood for the home is actually work that has an economic value.
Right.
So they are able to then factor this into the budgets to say this is work. If the woman didn't do this, how much would it cost to hire somebody to go and collect firewood and collect water? That has an economic value. If you calculate that, then you can say, wow, that economic contribution is huge. So even without working, and here's I think one of the challenges whereby we say that the Pakistan women's labor force participation is 25%, but if you really look at it hard, it's probably much higher, because we are not counting many of those millions of women who are in the agricultural sector, who are not getting paid, who are helping their husbands, brothers, who are working from home in Sindh and interior Punjab, where they are doing stitching and knitting and are not protected in any way, and they're not counted. But they're generating an income. And increasingly in Pakistan, I think there are very few households left with the economic challenges where you can survive on single income, the man being the breadwinner. And I think men have difficulty admitting it, but they want to have more and more women work. And I think that's another issue around masculinity and getting men to understand that it's okay to admit I can't do it and I can't handle the entire family, because the pressure on men in Pakistan are also tremendous. But there's no way that they can share this, because if they do share it, they'll be considered to be weak, and that's not something any Pakistani or even Desi man wants to admit. Are you kidding me? We don't cry, we're tough. Nothing can happen to us. We'll feed 15 of you, no problem. Right? So so I think that we certainly, so quick answer to the question was that yes, absolutely, we need to begin to count women's contribution.
Great. So gender and class are interrelated. In other words, working class women do not only face gender discrimination, but class exploitation as well. So do you think that using class lens to gender issues is also needed in a country like Pakistan?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we talk about gender, we always also talk about intersectionality in terms of, women are not like men. Women are not a homogeneous group. When we usually say women as if this is one big group that all think alike, that have similar challenges, and that's not the case. It is very different, and I mean there are multiple layers, right? So if you happen to be in Pakistan, if you're from Punjab, from Lahore, upper class, there's a certain level of privilege. You can be a woman from Thar, from a Hindu minority community. There's a very different reality that you face, right? So you can add more layers to it. You can add, if you're a woman with disability, or a woman living with HIV/AIDS, all these things I think have to be taken into account. And one example where recently this year there was this Aurat March, right? And there was a lot of hue and cry in the media, and part of it was also many people trying to say, oh, this is a non-issue, or this is an issue that only affects a small segment of affluent, privileged women, and to say that this wasn't an issue for women. But as you began to really look at how vast and widespread the Aurat March was, it spoke to women in Hyderabad, it spoke to lower income groups, it spoke to upper income groups. So I think the issue is that sometimes we say that, okay, we should only focus on rural, most marginalized, and that's absolutely true. But I will say at the same time, the urban affluent woman who is in Lahore or in Karachi, who comes from a very affluent family, has all the amenities at her disposal, but there are also challenges that she faces that one has to understand, and one should not diminish that. So again, in some of these very affluent families, everything looks rosy, but they are victims of violence. Some of them do not even have bank accounts in their own name. They have to use their husband's bank account. And that's a level of deprivation which may not be the case with women lower down the chain. Because we find sometimes women who are very poor actually are more mobile than the very rich, because out of necessity they are moving around. But the kind of social, cultural, religious restrictions we often have at more urban, affluent women, they can't leave the house without permission. So I'm just saying that we have to obviously apply that lens in terms of privilege. But I try to avoid saying, well, just because you happen to be socioeconomically very well off, that doesn't mean that your challenges in terms of gender, in terms of access, are much better necessarily than somebody who isn't in that same class. But then you have to look at not just class, ethnicity, race, disability, all different aspects.
Okay. So moving on, so gender-sensitive budgeting is becoming popular. Can you talk about it, and are policymakers in Pakistan considering it?
Okay, so gender-responsive budgeting, it's a mouthful. Not everybody understands. Even sometimes when we talk to government, they are like, what is this gender budget? Is it like a separate budget?
Yeah.
Is like a separate budget for women and a separate budget for men? I said, no, that's not what it is. Actually, it's to really break it down, when we talk about gender mainstreaming, this is one of the things we're talking about. We're saying that whenever you design a project or you design anything, an initiative, you have to understand how does it benefit or affect men and women differently. So just to give an example, when you are planning to purchase uniforms, obviously men and women's uniforms should be designed differently. There are budgetary implications. So if you don't think about how women and men will be using the product, then your budgets will be gender blind. They will just be like, okay, let's just make a uniform that looks the same, and if the men wear it, the women should wear it too. Which obviously is not gender responsive budgeting. That's one example. The other example would be, let's say, tourism, right? So tourism now in Pakistan is a big issue. Many provincial governments are very keen on boosting tourism. When you're even doing a tourism master plan or you're planning for tourists, you've got to think about things such as, okay, if I'm designing or I'm trying to make the resort look nice, do I have adequate street lighting? Because this is more important to women than it is to men. If it is dark, and men may not care, but it's important for women. Tourism, same thing. Are there enough? Maybe there should be women police, or there should be a way in which, if women are harassed, there should be a mechanism by which they can be protected. Toilets. Surprisingly, many women, when they travel outside to go on holiday anywhere in Pakistan, I bet one of the things in their mind is, okay, I'm not going to go on that long drive, and I'm not going to drink too much water.
Yeah.
Because if I do, I have to worry about. We don't think about these things as men, right? It'll take 5 hours. Okay, fine. Bring all the bottles of water. We don't care. But but for women, they would much rather be dehydrated and be very cautious as to where they go, because they're not sure as to if there is a clean, accessible restroom.
Right.
I mean, I know I come back to restrooms, but it is really such a big issue. It's such a big issue.
Yeah.
It's such a basic thing, but most resorts don't plan for this. Yeah. Even if you're driving, there are stops. Even in the stops, you will not find a decent one along the way. So that's related to tourism. Again, it's ties to gender responsive budgeting. Why? Because in your budgets, you'll have to think of, okay, if I'm building this resort, I need to make sure that it also is equally accessible, enjoyable for women as it is for men. So we have done some training for government officials for many years, but I don't think this is something that when mostly men, you see them huddling together to build plans. This isn't part of that thinking process, unless there are more women in that table to say, hey, hang on. Can we add this element? Right. Because you're missing this. So I think that actually means, a gender responsive budgeting will be much more possible if you simply have more women sitting there planning tourism master plans, or if it is, it can be a water policy, it can be agriculture policy, whatever it is. all of that has to be.
So it's basically goes back the participation of women in labor force, in workplace, and then it all comes down to the planning and everything.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the thing is your end result will be much more richer and comprehensive when you have more minds and diverse thinking put together. It is just so commonsensical.
Yeah.
But gender responsive budgeting is just a fancy way of saying that you need to ensure that whatever you plan and implement has a lens, has a woman or somebody who's thinking with women and men in mind, not just this is just suits us, our purposes and nothing else.
Right. Great. Thank you. So Pakistan is being a victim of violent extremism, and women are more vulnerable than men. But at the same time, they can also help develop resilience in communities against extremist narratives. So is UN Women doing anything on this front?
Well, it's quite a sensitive area, right? Violent extremism, Pakistan, not just Pakistan, but I mean, there are countries where we work in where, such as Jordan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, where this is an issue. And what we have noticed is, there's the National Action Plan. The government has made a massive effort in trying to stem the tide of extremism. Has been to some extent quite successful, but again, here I come back to an interesting story where one of my colleagues had come back from, and I'm forgetting the exact name of the village in KP, but there was a old lady who was sitting and watching a meeting going on, and the meeting was all with men. And she was just sitting and watching very patiently. And one of my colleagues went and spoke to her, and she said, "Beta, can you tell me what you guys were talking about?" And he said, "No, Dadi, you won't understand. It's not it's not something you'd be interested in." She said, "No, tell me, what is it about?" And she said, "Well, it's about security." And she just started laughing. And she says, "Why are you laughing?" She says, "Well, how would these idiots know anything about security? Ask me." Because right now I know exactly who is sitting in which room, how many sheep there are. I can tell you who's gone where. I can tell you when they're coming back. I know all the movements. And none of them do. So again, when you shared this with me, I said, well, the thing is, when it comes to security issues, it's such a male-dominated sector that nobody bothers to ask women their perspectives and their knowledge, which is very rich, and we don't think about these things. Some of these things are very commonsensical in that if you're going to try and address extremism, or you need, sometimes in some instances where there have been suicide bombers, for instance.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's the sister or the mother or the daughter or some female family member doing the stitching of the vest that is going to detonate. Therefore, she knows ahead of time. The question is, are we able to access that information in time as an early warning? Are we talking to them? Are we understanding the grievances? So the whole element of gender has really not been integrated into this narrative of violent extremism. Yes, women are both a victim, but they're also instrumentalized. We've also seen in places like in the urban centers in Karachi, where women are actually being told actively to raise funds through selling their jewelry and whatnot to fund some of this activity. So I think the only thing that we're trying to do now is we don't have a clear understanding as to the role of women, both positive and negative. And we're trying to gather that information as best we can so that hopefully then we can engage with law enforcement and say, well, end of the day, if you want to make a dent, as other countries have done, you're going to need to have a stronger gender focus. But also, if you look at the women in the police services, because oftentimes the police are the front lines to stop some of these things from happening. There's only 2% of women, maybe less, 2% women in the police force. It's increasing, but in Balochistan it's 0.3%. So with so few women in the police and law enforcement, it's going to be very hard to tackle something as critical as extremism. So all I can say now is we're looking at not just violent extremism, but also see how can we build social cohesion? How can we build greater tolerance? Because there's also the challenge that we have in Pakistan and in other countries. There is an increasing tide of intolerance or polarizing views. So we can always disagree, but if it becomes so antagonistic, and sometimes if you just go through Twitter, sometimes I mean the kind of language being used and thrown at each other, it's and that's another dangerous place for women to be, by the way, on social media. And I mean I don't get anywhere near that kind of fan mail or hate mail or whatever, but it's really quite distressing when I do. Sometimes, I mean, I'm seeing threads and they are really terrible things, threats. Just because you have a different view, you are threatened with rape, you're threatened with worse things. I mean, I know I'm going into another area, but still around extremism. That's a form of extremism.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So and it manifests itself online. So if you can't be safe in public, you should at least be safe online. But even that's not possible.
Yeah.
So that's a very dangerous place to be for women. If you're being attacked online and offline, we have some serious work to do.
We do. So during your time in Pakistan, which are the areas regarding gender issues on which you have observed the progress through this entire period? It's a tough one.
You want my honest answer?
Yeah.
I don't really. I mean, I like to say I always like to find the glass half full.
Yeah.
I was really struggling to think about where I've seen. You see, it's easier to look at progress in Pakistan over decades. If you look at it since 80s, yes, you've come an awfully long way. But if you ask me in the 4 years that I've been here, and I hate admitting it, but I really find that there has been a level of stagnation after that progress, or in fact even pushback. You know, the gains that Pakistan has made, there is also risk of it sliding back. So, I mean, if you look at the global gender gap report, for the past 4 years, Pakistan has been consistently second to last. It's not improved. It's the only other country that's worse is Yemen.
Yeah.
But clearly, Yemen is in a different situation. It's an active kind of war zone. In Pakistan, it's not. And Afghanistan probably would have been there, but they were not included in the list. But even then, the one thing that the two things I might say is that I think that what we are finding, what I am finding some hope in, is that I do see more women working, although not counted, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
There is also a movement, as with urbanization, a greater shift away from the extended families to nuclear families. With that, there is also, in some respects, a greater assertion of women being able to assert their rights, also by necessity, because if you're in a nuclear family, often you don't have the benefit of having other people, look after you. So you have to, typically there are more of those women are actually working and helping out their spouses. So there is that, it's beginning to change. The other thing I think that's a bit positive, it's also negative, but in a positive way, a lot more women are speaking out against violence than I have seen in the past year, 2 years. Of course there was the Me Too movement. One can argue and debate about how that is going in Pakistan, whether it's gaining any traction or whether it's dying. But I've certainly sensed that more and more women are refusing to take harassment of any sort as something which just should be tolerated. That comes with pros and cons. On the positive side, I think it's also putting many men on notice and making them very uncomfortable, which is a good thing. At least the men I've spoken to, they're quite concerned. And I'll tell you one quick story again. I'm sorry. This was in a government office, and I will not name the government office because I'll get in trouble. I'm on camera. This was almost a year ago. I walked into a government office, and this was when this Me Too headline hit Pakistan, and it was really in the news with the case of these celebrities. He said to me, "Mr. Kazi," after I was talking about something completely different, he said, "We must do something about this Me Too thing." I was very intrigued. I said, "Wow, I'm hearing this from a senior official in the government, a man. I said, yes, absolutely, tell us. He said, you must put a stop to this damn thing. And I said, okay. He said, no, but it's going out of hand. You see, this is highly inefficient. I said, I don't understand how it's inefficient. He says, well, let me explain. You see, in our office, we have many young girls joining. And, if you speak to them in a slightly high voice, tomorrow they will come crying and saying, "Ji, hamare saath me too ho gaya." This was his words, not my words. And I just looked at him. I said, I don't think that's how it works. Yeah. It's not. And he says, no. But you see, in some of these meetings that we have, I am having to invite a man to sit in the room, and that man serves no other purpose than to just make sure that tomorrow, if that woman says something against me, Hes Witness. I thought to myself, oh my God, what is, this is some really deep thinking about how to. So I really turned to him. I said, sir, with all due respect, if you haven't harassed anybody, you have nothing to worry about. Yeah. Of course, then he was sort of, like, oh, okay, no. But, and then he also started saying, but there must be a statute of limitations. In my younger years when I was in college, I must have harassed many girls. Now what if they remember? And they come after me. And I said, well, sir, I really don't know how to solve that problem, but maybe you should tell the next generation and others that they shouldn't follow this. Yeah. So I'm just giving this example to say that I have never had that kind of a conversation before with men. And these are senior people in the government who actually are beginning to think oh my goodness.
Thinking about it.
So they're thinking about the implications. Mm-hmm. I can only hope that this has resulted in some men who might have been indulging in this behavior in the past, now beginning to reassess and say to themselves, okay, I didn't realize that was harassment, or I thought I could get away with it, and now I have to behave very differently. And I think that is, to me, somewhat hopeful. Now, I still feel that the situation will get a lot worse in Pakistan before it gets better, because the kind of pace at which cases are coming up. Recently, there was this another movie star. What's his name? Mohsin something. Right. Okay. And now, and I can bet you there will be many more. Yeah. Because one after the other, they keep coming, and they will keep coming because the awareness is there. It doesn't mean this is increased. It just means that more and more women have realized that that's it. We're not dealing with this. Mm-hmm. So you asked me, this is one of those. I think I would say in a way it's a positive thing, mm-hmm. because with this realization comes this understanding also by men, because we're having this conversation that this is not acceptable. It may have been acceptable 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even last year, but not anymore. We're in 2019. I want to still say that said, I'm still very hopeful in terms of Pakistan and gender. I think that you have, even among the government and the parliamentarians, we haven't talked much about parliamentarians, but women in public office that I have met in the new administration, some of them are actually stellar. They're amazing. Yes, sometimes they have to say things that they don't want to say necessarily, but they have to please some of the men around them. But, and I say this to some of my own team members, I say, no, gender equality is not a cricket match. If one side wins doesn't mean the other side loses. We're in it together. So I think that if something is positive for the women of this country, it's also going to help the men. And I think that's a realization that is coming too slowly, but it needs to come.
Right. Okay.
Which is why I love this job.
So,
in fact, that's why I'm glad that you're on the other side, because then I wouldn't be just a man and a man having a conversation about gender. That wouldn't be very good. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming here today.